My name's Eitan Mubarak. I am the National Iranian American Council Community and Advocacy Associate, and I'm also our New York City chapter co-captain. I'm very pleased to be here with you all. Thank you so much. I also want to thank everyone at the People's Forum. Can we have a round of applause for the People's Forum? Thank you so much. They've been very generous in letting us host this here. It's really the first public Know Your Rights program that we are putting on with so many great allies, and I'm going to get into some of our partners that we have here today for you all. Just a bit of, I guess, housekeeping. Initially, we are recording the event, but the event, that recording is only for our internal purposes. None of this is going to be shared publicly, and we will hold questions for all of you with the recording off for the final 30 minutes of the event, for us to talk and be in community, and for you to ask comfortably without fear of anything, whatever you'd like to any of us here, any of the experts. So I just wanted to make that clear. And you know, in addition to the Know Your Rights portion of the event, this is also a Know Your Rights Norooz. It's a little bit after Norooz, but I wanted to welcome to the stage my New York City co-captain Dara for some opening remarks to acknowledge Norooz and our chapter. Thank you so much, Dara.
Thank you, Eitan. So I'm, as Eitan mentioned, I'm a co-captain with Eitan of the NIAC New York chapter. So NIAC is the National Iranian American Council. It's the largest grassroots organization for Iranian Americans that are pro-peace and pro-civil rights of all Americans, actually. So I'm just going to give a little bit of background about Norooz, since this event is structured as a Know Your Rights on Norooz. Norooz, which literally in Persian means new day, is the Iranian New Year. So on the calendar, it's the first day of spring, which corresponds to the first day of the year. The roots of Norooz are in Zoroastrianism, which was the dominant religion in ancient Iran. But today, it's celebrated by Iranians, Afghans, Kurds, Tajiks, Uzbeks, Azeris, and many other cultures throughout the region, regardless of religion. In Iran, the festivities of Norooz, they begin on the Wednesday eve before Norooz with Charshanbe Suri, which is a time of fireworks and fire jumping, and it ends just actually a few days ago, the holiday season, approximately 2 weeks after Norooz, with picnics. It's called Sizde Bedar. It's a time of celebration, family gatherings, gift-giving, travel, community. So the cruel irony here, and the reason that it's applicable, but also in a very ironic and upsetting sense, is that the Trump administration's list of countries, the report for the list of countries to ban, was originally due on March 21st, basically the day or the day after Norooz. It's been postponed since the draft was leaked, but it appears to be even worse than the Muslim ban during his first term. So here are our chapter and the other organizations that we're presenting this event together. We're obviously interested in grassroots advocacy and Know Your Rights. So I will be passing it back to Eitan to give a little bit more background.
Thank you so much. And just a little bit of background, too, on how we show up in the institutions and what our approach is at NIAC, at the National Iranian American Council, in that strategy. You know, NIAC has been around for 20 years, and as a nonprofit, we try to create spaces like this around the country. We have chapter leaders in 14 chapters, 14 states around the country. We have members in all 50 states. And we recently polled a list of 200,000 registered Iranian American voters at the end of last year. So this information sharing is crucial to keeping the community informed of their rights and to all of us building political power around these issues. In 2017, we mobilized to counter against the Muslim ban then. And there is a huge coalition of groups around the country who are fighting against it now and filling in the rapid response gaps. Our first set of presenters, first, two amazing women from Muslim advocates who provide expert representation in the courts, in the policymaking process, and in the public dialogue so American Muslims and all people can live free from discrimination. They litigate, educate, and advocate to uphold our country's promise of equal treatment under the law of all Americans. So excited to have Golnaz Fahimi here, who serves as the legal director for Muslim Advocates. She worked with and for historically structuralized, marginalized people across a wide spectrum of contexts and strategies. Her experience encompasses immigration defense, criminal defense, defense of alleged war on terror suspects, civil rights actions, support defense of students on the front lines of the U.S. movement for Palestinian lives, technical assistance for a variety of movement leaders and partners, collaborative advocacy with them. So excited to have Golnaz here. Prior to joining Muslim Advocates, she was senior staff attorney at the Civil Rights Education and Enforcement Center, leading its work and the intersection of immigrant justice and disability justice. And joining her is Sadaf Hassan, who is a staff attorney with Muslim Advocates. Her work has covered issues on immigrant justice, surveillance, police misconduct, wrongful convictions, and low-wage workers' rights. Sadaf was an Immigrant Justice Corps Fellow at Brooklyn Defender Services, where she worked closely with non-citizen and immigrant communities at the intersections of criminal, immigration, and family legal systems. Thank you so much, both, for being here. Can I welcome you to the stage? Mic check.
Mic check. Thank you so much.
Great.
Hi.
So I will step off. I will step off and let you. Do we have the clicker for you?
She has a clicker.
Okay.
Do you have the PowerPoint on?
Can we get the thing?
Thanks, Sadaf.
Thank you. Sorry.
Okay, my name is Golnaz Fahimi. So grateful to be here with you guys and excited to be co-presenting with my excellent colleague Sadaf. I think we're going to sort of start things off by giving you a little bit of a roadmap of what we're going to cover. We're going to start off by providing some context for the current political climate and what we're referring to as the threat landscape that is the foundation for what we are seeing to be the ideological targeting of non-citizens. We're also going to get into how any of us, especially those of us who are non-citizens, can understand what the sources of those threats are and how to assess related immigration risks and weigh those for ourselves. And then the content's going to move into a Know Your Rights presentation addressing interactions with U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, known as ICE, and our colleagues, our lovely colleagues at the Immigrant and Non-Citizen Rights Clinic of the CUNY School of Law will cover that portion. And then we're going to close out with community safety, which a colleague from the ACLU/New York Civil Liberties Union, NICLU, is going to cover for us. Okay, so in terms of like, how do we even wrap our heads around the threat landscape that non-citizens face with respect to viewpoint-driven targeting? I think the foundation of that targeting is two different executive orders of President Trump. One of those executive orders was among the onslaught of executive orders that issued on Inauguration Day. It's called Protecting the United States from Foreign Terrorists and Other National Security and Public Safety Threats. I think that many of us choose to refer it by what we see it to be, which is a vetting and bans related executive order. It's actually an executive order that does quite a lot of things. It packs in quite a lot of harm and specter of harm. But for our purposes, among the things that it does is It puts squarely an issue, ideologically driven, viewpoint driven, vetting, screening, and targeting, meaning enforcement, against non-citizens, including on the basis of conduct that in the administration's view can be deemed to call for quote unquote sectarian violence, whatever the administration understands that to mean. And I think more concerningly and much more broadly, it also allows for these measures to be taken against non-citizens who, in the administration's view, are calling for, quote unquote, the overthrow of the culture on which our constitutional republic stands. So I think that's worth sort of pausing on and bottom lining in that culture is a very squishy term that can be read to mean many different things. And I think this aspect of this executive order pretty much sets up the administration to undertake immigration-related consequences against any non-citizen whose viewpoints it is hostile to. The other executive order that lays the foundation for the ideological targeting we're seeing is called Additional Measures to Combat Anti-Semitism. And I think many of us refer to it as the Anti-Palestine Executive Order. It's not limited in its scope or impacts to the interests of non-citizens. It does a lot of things that put in issue the interests and the expression of citizens as well. But for purposes of our remarks, I want to zero in on some content within it that really sharply puts at risk non-citizen students in particular, who've been vocal for Palestinian lives and freedom. So that aspect of this executive order asks agency heads to make recommendations to the president by the end of March was the deadline for quote unquote guidance that the administration can disseminate en masse to campuses about terrorism-related grounds of immigration detention and removal, so that campuses in turn can quote unquote monitor for that conduct and report back to the administration about non-citizen students that in the administration's view are targetable for detention and or removal based on these very broad, overbroad grounds of immigration detention and removal. So what we've seen since the issuance of these executive orders is a lot of rhetorical pylon, like a lot of gusto rhetorically, at the level of the president, at the level of the Secretary of State, and we haven't seen only rhetoric. We've seen follow through in terms of action, notably starting with the targeting of Mahmoud Khalil, and then that list of targeted non-citizen students who ICE has taken into detention and initiated removal proceedings against keeps growing. And I think, like, for our purposes, it's worthwhile to uplift that a lot of what is driving these prerogatives stems from massive social media surveillance that is accessing public social media content to sort of zero in on viewpoints supportive of Palestine, viewpoints critical of the Israeli government. And this is through a lens of a way of defining anti-Semitism that the administration has embraced through the second executive order that I mentioned that allows for the conflation of anti-Jewish hate with criticisms of the Israeli government. But there are key ways in which anyone who's in the crosshairs of these policies can consider reducing risks to themselves. And some of that includes decision-making around social media and decision-making around device accessibility. So is this me or you?
It's you.
It's me? Okay, I'm so sorry. So Sadaf and I, along with a lot of attorneys that we've been working closely with and a pool of volunteer attorneys who we've worked really hard to recruit, one of the things that's keeping us really busy right now are individualized consults with non-citizen students, faculty, other constituencies across campuses nationally who are just wanting to understand, like, how do they even begin to wrap their head around what the landscape might mean for them and what might be the amount of risk they face. So the framework here is sort of a framework that we apply in those consults. So at step one, we try to kind of educate and inform about what the sources of risk are, meaning what are the government entities that have any immigration-related powers that can be weaponized against non-citizens for viewpoint-related reasons or otherwise. Number two, in assessing risks, what are the vectors of exposure for possible viewpoint-driven targeting of any of us? So what are the ways in which these agencies know or can know about us and our viewpoints? And then at step three, is where some very personalized, individualized weighing happens. So once you have a sense of what might be known or knowable about you and the viewpoints to which you have to which the administration is hostile, what are other sorts of factors and considerations to sort of put on the scales so that you decide what, if anything, you want to keep the same or change about your decision-making and your behavior, whether it's to reduce risk or to continue to lean into expression, which a lot of the students that we're in contact with have made very clear is an ongoing value of theirs.
Okay, I think that's me. I might switch because then I can see everyone. And can you hold the clicker?
Yeah.
I haven't done a Know Your Rights in person in a while, so it's yeah, thanks so much, Gulnaz, for grounding us in some of the policies to help understand in terms of the sources of risk, who they are. So just to take a step back, source of risk is our government, Department of Homeland Security. And I thought it would be important in terms of, in order to know what your rights are, to understand the functions of these different agencies, what powers they have, and so then you know how to resist and assert your rights. So Department of Homeland Security, as a lot of you know, was born out of 9/11. And so a lot of these different functions are viewing, a lot of our communities, Muslim, Arab, Black, South Asian communities from a lens of national security. And so we just wanted to take a minute to to talk about, in terms of the Department of Homeland Security, how that's broken up into a few different sub-agencies, and then trying to understand your source of risk based on your contact with that agency. And so you wouldn't normally think UCIS, U.S. Citizen and Immigration Services, the agency in which you apply affirmatively for immigration benefits, whether green card, citizenship, asylum, as a source of risk. But there is an intersection between affirmatively applying for benefits in terms of the way in which they can review an application. So if they, in the course of reviewing your application, find that the person is removable or deportable, that can then lead to adverse consequences in terms of, putting them in potentially in removal proceedings. So we'll talk about in terms of how to do an individual risk assessment to see in terms of before applying affirmatively to UCIS, whether that's risky for you, for a community member or a loved one. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, I think we all know now, ICE, just in terms of what we've seen, like in terms of video footage of Mahmoud and Rumeysa, in terms of the agency that basically has the power to put folks in detention and to deport them. So they have the power to determine who is removable. CBP and TSA at the airport, Customs and Border Protection and Transportation Security Administration. I'm sure it's all in our minds right now, like in terms of what we're seeing, even US citizens in terms of at the border, there being digital surveillance, kind of what Gulnaz has flagged. And so just knowing that usually, especially, our communities, especially post 9/11 context, have faced heightened scrutiny, but especially now there's a level of intersection of surveillance, but specifically from the lens of viewpoint targeting on Palestine, or even, as Gulnaz said, any kind of viewpoint that is hostile to the administration. Go to the next slide. And then I'll kick it over to Gulnaz to talk about, so there's Department of Homeland Security, and then there's US Department of State.
Thanks for bearing with me. So the U.S. Department of State is an agency that does a lot of things, including manage foreign policy for the United States. Among the things that it does through consulates and embassies, scattered around countries all across the world is it issues visas, which are entry permits that basically allow non-US citizens to gain entry into the United States for specific purposes and usually for a specific duration. So in the campus context, there's a status called F1 that allows you to be a student of higher education as a non-US citizen. And typically, like the first step for you is to get an entry permit issued by a consulate or embassy that would allow you to come into the US for this purpose to study. I want to uplift that the entry permit is different and distinct from the legal status that an arriving international student attains once they're admitted into the US. That legal status is co-stewarded by both the federal government and the sponsoring campus through a database system called the Student Exchange Visitor Information System, or SEVIS. And the reason why I bring it up is that there's a lot of news lately about a concerning development in that there are notifications happening en masse through SEVIS about terminations of student visa holder status for no reasons in some instances, or for reasons that don't kind of track with the law in other instances. So this is like a new wave of targeting that we all have to kind of pay attention to. And both of these things, like what the government can do to your status through the SEVIS system, and what on the back end a consulate can do to revoke your entry permit, either and both of those things are things that can render someone within the US who's an international student vulnerable to being charged deportable and exposed to contact from ICE that could result in detention or removal proceedings, or both. Should we?
And in terms of trying to do the analysis of what exposure, in terms of what exposes you to the risk, I see it in 3 different ways. So what is public about you? And so in terms of like, if you look up your name, what comes up? For some folks, Canary Mission comes up, and we're seeing actually a lot at the border, folks who are on the Canary Mission, it's actually coming up in their secondary inspection, and because the narrative has already been done, right, from the Zionist lens of this person is a threat. And so CBP is actually using Canary Mission to question folks during secondary inspection. And in some cases, we've seen for folks just entering on a tourist visa, denying them entry. So important to know what just shows up for you when you look yourself up. And then also your social media accounts, are they private, are they public, getting a sense of that. And then it's also what information does the government know about you? And as we talked about, there's Department of Homeland Security and there's 3 sub-agencies, and they all have information sharing amongst them. And so, what's on your UCIS application, consular visa applications, CBP inspections, knowing that when someone has gone through secondary inspection, there's actually a transcript of the whole interview, and that these government agencies can have access to that. And then if you're in immigration court proceedings, what kind of filings are in court? And then there's third-party information. So what do third parties have that can be potentially shared with Department of Homeland Security? So as we've seen, there's hostile third-party individuals or organizations like Batar, a Zionist organization that, as we've seen early on in the administration, we're giving names of non-citizen students to Department of Homeland Security. So, we've consulted some students who actually have been contacted by Batar, or on just even their social media have been tagged by Batar, tagged Secretary Marco Rubio. So things like that is when we're talking to folks, getting a sense of that. And then as Gulnaz mentioned, in terms of the campus context, there's information sharing between the university and Department of Homeland Security, because if you're a non-citizen student here, you have to share certain information, just baseline in terms of maintaining your status. So that's even just basic things like your name, date of birth. What else, Gulnaz?
So in the SEVIS system, the required disclosures that have to be provided to the federal government for students on student visas are name, date of birth, country of origin, address, and then also any changes in academic status that impact access to a full course of study, because that's a legal requirement for being an international student of higher education. Yeah.
Yeah, so for example, if someone has had student discipline, like has gone through student disciplinary hearings, what has been the outcome? Like, were they suspended? Did they have any adverse outcome in terms of figuring out, would that trigger some kind of violation of the terms of their visa? And then in the employment context, the executive order that Gulnaz flagged in terms of the one that conflates anti-Semitism with Palestine organizing, there is a mention in terms of analyzing administrative complaints. So in the employment context, that could be two things. And I think there's a little more research that we need to do in terms of advocates and make sure we're on the same page, how much of that information is actually shared with government agencies. But I think it's important just to know in terms of trying to figure out what your risk is, if either someone has filed a complaint against you alleging anti-Semitism, or you yourself have put forth a complaint against someone else, even if it's in the context of, let's say, anti-Palestinian racism in the workplace, if the outcome of that is that the opposite of what you wanted, like, that's also really important context. And then I think, as we mentioned, criminal records, nexus between immigration and criminal legal system, and they have all that info.
So when we've sort of run through with people what the nature of their exposure and risks are, we usually get to a point where they begin to do some weighing for themselves, and we try to help inform that weighing with other factors that may deserve a place on the scales, at least for some people. So we ask people to sort of trust us to name for themselves and for us, do they have any personal vulnerabilities that might make contending with immigration enforcement or border enforcement harder for them than it might be for someone who doesn't have those vulnerabilities? So that might be a mental health vulnerability, a cognitive vulnerability, or a medical condition. Those are things that we ask about for that reason. Likewise, a lot of us have dependents who rely on us. That might be children, it might be elderly folks, it may be loved ones or friends who have disabilities or medical vulnerabilities. And it's a similar sort of inquiry, like if immigration enforcement against you is going to separate you from people who are reliant on you, how do you want to think about what that means for yourself in terms of assessing your risk and considering whether and how to change anything about your decision-making or your behavior? And then last but certainly not least, because it's something that keeps coming up over and over in our consults, at least for some students and other folks who are in the crosshairs of these policies, on the affirmative sort of side of the weighing, what appetite for and interest does someone have in ongoing activism or ongoing expression of viewpoints that really matter to them? And that could be because of personal values that make those viewpoints matter. It can also be because of collective values or movement values about why certain viewpoints matter. And again, I'll just say we keep hearing over and over again in many instances that this is something that, at least for some people, gets not only weight on the scale, but pretty substantial weight on the scale. But we never sort of, our jobs aren't to sort of tell people, do this, don't do that. So we just try to help guide people through things to kind of identify and figure out how to weigh for themselves consistent with their goals and their concerns. In terms of how we talk through ways of risk reduction, harm reduction, especially for people who conclude for themselves that they are at high risk and they don't want to kind of be idle. They want to do something about it to reduce it, even if only around the margins. Social media, because of the extent to which it's surveilled, is sort of an arena that can lend itself to different decisions as an end user that may be risk reductive, but at the cost of expression. And so one sort of option is to consider what your settings are changing public settings to private settings. Another sort of option for folks who have very, very large networks of friends and followers is to ask yourself, are there any trolls lurking in there? Is there anyone whose viewpoints are very hostile to the ones that I uplift? And what could that mean for me in terms of risk, in terms of like a backdoor way that the government might get to know about me? The device hygiene aspect of this first item has special relevance to actual encounters with immigration law enforcement agents. So within the interior, that's ICE. At the border, that's CBP. But in either of those contexts, if the contact that you have is under circumstances where you have a device on you, and many of us carry smartphones that tell a lot about us if others get access to them, how can you sort of plan ahead and think ahead about the accessibility of your device and or the contents of your device in a way that might prove risk reductive? And so I think peers are going to get into this, but some tips are like turning off Face ID as a way of trying to secure a device, turning off thumbprint ID, because both of those are things that can be used against our will through physical force to unlock a device, unlike a long and strong alphanumeric passcode. For folks who consider themselves to be at high risk and want to kind of do something risk reductive, a lot of times what this means is anticipatory emergency planning. What can be thought through and planned now so that there's as little harm at the point at which enforcement precipitates against us as possible. And so oftentimes this means preparing a legal rapid response. So this might mean connecting with a lawyer, having them prepare a filing to have in the wings so that they can spring into action if and when enforcement arises. And in many instances, it means something proactive. So not even waiting for an enforcement agency to begin to take steps towards you, but preparing something affirmative that would enable you to ask a court for protection. But even that requires some weighing, because for some folks, it raises the question of retaliation. And we have seen some examples of how that can happen. So this can be even a pretty nuanced area. And then for anyone who is a caregiver to dependents, I think, I get emotional sometimes, sorry. One of the hardest things about these consults is talking through with people the kind of anticipatory planning about who can care for their dependents if they're snatched up. And oftentimes that means pretty in-depth consultations around designations of guardians. And it's a very tough conversation to have, but for some people it's a way of regaining agency and sort of taking back control over what's a very bananas and out of control circumstance. And then the other thing that we love to get into with people who are worried about their risk is what they should know about their rights in the moment of an encounter with an immigration law enforcement arm, because that is a pretty pivotal juncture in which harm reduction and risk reduction it's like alive and well. And I think with that, we're going to pass it over to our colleagues from the Immigrant and Non-Citizen Rights Clinic of the CUNY School of Law. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, hi everyone. My name's Parima. It's fine. My name's Parima. I'm a student in the CUNY Immigrant and Non-Citizens Rights Clinic. This is one of our co-directors, Professor Nermeen Arastu, lawyer, scholar, artist extraordinaire.
You can visit our website at CUNY Law Immigrant and Non-Citizen Rights Clinic to learn more about what we do. But I know time is short, so we're going to skip the intros and go straight into the really practical part of the presentation. Thank you, Muslim advocates, for that incredible overview. This is just like kind of taking from that context, what do you do when you're in these moments? What are some ways to do harm reduction? Thank you.
Yeah, so this is a quick overview of what we're planning to cover. So we kind of broke it up into two buckets. The first one is upon contact with ICE, and that can be at home, on the street, or on a college or university campus. And then there's also after ICE contact, which, like Gulnaz was alluding to, that's a really emotional thing to envision, but it's helpful to think these things through in advance. And we know that there's like a spectrum of familiarity with this type of like know your rights information. So forgive us if some of this is really basic or if it's overly complicated. There will be time for questions like Itan mentioned at the end. So this is starting off with specifically what you can do if ICE shows up, God forbid, at your home. We have at the top the golden rule of this scenario, which is do not open the door. So if you hear a knock at your door and you're not, expecting anyone, you don't know who it could be, the safest thing to do first is, if you live in a multi-story home or building and you have a window that faces the street, like you definitely want to try and get a peek at who it could be before you even vocally answer at the door. But if you don't have access to anything like that or a little like eye hole that you can see into the hallway with, the first thing you should do is ask who it is, ask them to identify themselves. We're going to mention in each context, it's really important, like Sadaf and Gulnaz mentioned, there's a lot of different government actors that could potentially, that you could potentially be interfacing with. So it's helpful to try to get information about like who is actually at your door, with the caveat that ICE lies. So, they might lie about who they are, what authority they have. And because of that, it's really helpful to ask the question, once you know that it's like the government at your door, ask them if they have a judicial warrant, because I know there's been like information circulating about this, but if you're not familiar, there's a difference between a judicial warrant and an administrative warrant. In the past, it was much more common for ICE to show up with an administrative warrant, which does not give them authority to actually enter your home or question you. It's becoming a little more common for ICE to actually have a judicial warrant, but it's still really important for at the very beginning of this interaction to figure out, does ICE even have that? So what is a judicial warrant? We're going to show you a picture on the next slide, but basically some three like key details that a judicial warrant will have is number one, a judge's signature, probably somewhere near the bottom of the document, but that's something that's very easy to spot, a signature, and it should have like a judge title under that signature line. It should also have your name and your address, because this document is supposed to give ICE authority to come and speak to you or to enter your specific home. So if it doesn't have your information on it, that also is not authorizing ICE to actually enter your home. And then another thing you can look for on a judicial warrant will be the name of the court that the judge sits at. And so if you ask ICE if they have a judicial warrant and they say yes, still ask them to slide it under the door or like through the side of the door so that you can actually see the document. It's really important to not just believe them if they say or give you their word that they have a judicial warrant, because ICE lies. So sorry that it's a little blurry, but this is an example of a judicial warrant next to an administrative warrant. And this graphic is really helpful because it gives you some visual cues. So like I was saying, down here, you see that this judicial warrant is signed by a judge. It has the judge's name and title at the bottom. It's also pointing out that you want to check that it's current. It has the name of the court at the top, and it also has the address. The warrant might also specify like what actually can be searched. So, a warrant might give someone authority to search a home, but not actually collect documents from you. And so that's another important distinction to look for. This is an administrative warrant, which you'll see, like it's signed by an immigration officer, doesn't have the name of the court, no judge's signature, much less information. And so if an officer is trying to pass off an administrative warrant as though it's a judicial warrant, these visual cues are really helpful to keep in mind. If they do not have, I also have copies of those things if Oh, great. Thank you. So yeah, if ICE does not have a judicial warrant, then the only other way for them to get access into your home is if you give them consent. So it's also really important to verbalize as often as possible that you do not give them consent to enter your home. And if you open the door even a little bit, it's totally understandable. Some people might want to open the door a crack to hear them better, or because they were caught off guard, or to like see if they're in a uniform or something. But it's crucial to not do that. Don't open the door even a little crack if they don't have a judicial warrant, because they can force their way into your home. They can push the door open and then later claim that you did give them consent. So even in that situation, you want to keep repeating that you don't give them consent to enter your home. And obviously, this is a really terrifying and stressful situation to envision, but it's also really important to remain calm so that the situation doesn't escalate, and just calmly state, please leave. I do not want to speak to you. You don't have authority to enter my home, and just keep asking them to leave, but in a calm manner. Now, if ICE somehow enters your home anyway, let's say you accidentally open the door, they forced their way in, they followed you in somehow, some key rights to remember are the right to remain silent. So I know this can be like difficult to do in practice if you have a government officer in your home, but you do have the right to remain silent and not answer some of the questions they're asking you. So helpful phrases are, again, repeating that you did not give them permission to enter, that you don't consent to a search, and that you don't want to speak to them without an attorney. If it feels safe to do so, once ICE has entered your home, you can take a video of the interaction, but we want to recognize that, for a lot of different reasons, that might not be safe for everyone to do, or it might unintentionally escalate the situation. And if you live in a household where there are children or elders present, it can also be helpful to inform the officers of that earlier on, so that you can, as like a protective measure. And similarly with if you're pregnant or if you have a disability or a mental condition, it can also be helpful to state that towards the beginning of the interaction, in the chance that a lot of their behavior is discretionary. So if it happens to affect how they treat you or how they act in the situation, it doesn't hurt. If ICE enters your home, do not sign anything without speaking to a lawyer. You have the right to an attorney, but unlike what you might have heard about in criminal courts and criminal situations, the right to an attorney doesn't mean that the government will provide one for you in immigration proceedings. But even though they're not going to provide you with a lawyer, you can state that I know I have the right to an attorney and I don't want to answer your questions until I've spoken to one. And like we mentioned earlier, it's also important not to hand over documents unless ICE has a judicial warrant that specifies that they have permission to take XYZ specified documents from you. If they just come into your house and start asking for your identity documents, your passport, your student registration documents, you don't have to hand those over unless they have that warrant. But it's also really important, no matter what the situation is, do not lie to ICE and do not give them false documents, because that can really, really hurt your case in the future. And after, God forbid, if ICE has entered your home and now they've left, there are some things that can be helpful to do in the immediate aftermath, and that's writing down whatever you can remember about the interaction. And this is helpful, I should have stated earlier, this information is really helpful to share with everyone in the household. That way, everyone in your household is prepared for what their rights are in a situation like this. And that way, the more eyes you have on the interaction, the more information you can try to preserve afterwards, which could be helpful in legal proceedings. The next context that we're going to talk about is if ICE approaches you on the street. So before I get into these steps, if you're approached on the street by a stranger, you may have seen in videos circulating on social media that ICE does not always wear identifying uniforms or badges when they arrest someone. They're often in plain clothes, they may be masked, they are likely not going to be super forthcoming about their identity. So if you are approached by a stranger and if they start asking you questions about yourself, it is important to be a little bit on guard and try to get information about who that person is before you tell them anything. Even if they just come up to you and ask your name, before you say, yeah, what's up, you want to ask who they are. And like Golnaz and Sadaf pointed out in their presentation, there are various different government officials that might be pretending like they have immigration authority. So that can include NYPD officers, Homeland Security investigators, and a bunch of other officials who are not actually ICE. So I should have said that step one is figuring out who is actually talking to you. But once you've identified that it is ICE questioning you, the first thing you want to do is ask if you're free to leave. Because oftentimes ICE will approach people or stop people who they don't necessarily have legal authority to be stopping. And if you ask them, am I free to leave? That forces them to make a decision about how the rest of the interaction is going to go. And you should repeat that question until you get a clear answer. They may try to disarm you by saying, acting very casual and saying, oh, why are you being so paranoid? I'm just trying to get to know you, or I'm trying to ask you a few questions. And that can be very disorienting, but really try to keep asking that question until you get a clear answer. If ICE says that you are not free to leave and that they need you to answer certain questions, you can state that you wish to remain silent, because again, you have that right to remain silent during these interactions with ICE. If you have an attorney, needless to say, you should absolutely call them as soon as you have realized that you're in a situation where you're not free to leave. And if ICE tries to search you, again, you want to state that you do not consent to the search. I know it's frustrating that a lot of the advice we give is to kind of preserve rights in the future after harm has been done. So even though saying that you do not consent to a search may not stop ICE from actually searching you in the moment, it can be really helpful down the line if your immigration case moves forward or if you're put into removal proceedings. It's also important to not physically resist the search, but keep repeating that you do not consent or you have not given them permission to search you. If ICE tries to arrest you after they have stopped you on the street, the safest option is to comply and to follow their instructions, because at that point, you don't want to escalate the situation further. But it may be helpful to share certain information, like if you have kids who depend on you, if you have already been required to do ICE check-ins, that you've been complying with those check-ins and there's no need for them to arrest you. If you have a medical condition that requires specific treatment or medication, that can also be really important to point out. But unfortunately, there's no guarantee that sharing this information is actually going to materially change your situation. But once you've reached this point of the situation, it's kind of like you want to throw whatever at the wall and see what sticks. And so it can be helpful to share that at the beginning. Again, do not lie to ICE. This can cause serious problems for your case in the future. God forbid, if you're stopped by ICE and your children or other children are with you, ask for permission to make an emergency phone call to your emergency contact or an authorized caretaker. And then something else that you can do after or when ICE is arresting you or after you've been arrested is to try to understand where you're being taken. A common pathway that we're seeing right now is that people who are picked up, especially in the New York and New Jersey area, are first taken to a detention center in Elizabeth, New Jersey, and then from there are moved to other detention centers, most frequently in the South, oftentimes in Louisiana. And so gathering as much information as you can about where you actually are and where you're going is really important so that you can then inform your family or your attorney once you understand that. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Prima. Do you mind going back 2 slides for me? One thing I wanted to just say about this slide. So, I mean, one is like immigration is one of like the most complex areas of law. It's really hard to do these types of presentations because there are some general things we can say and we're trying to say them, but a lot of things go into your individual circumstances. And so one thing particularly on this slide I wanted to just go back and point out is if there's like a difference, you're in a different state of vulnerability if you're already on US immigration's radar somehow. Like you already have an ICE check-in. They know you exist, they know your address, you're already checking in. Maybe in those situations, you could talk about compliance. But if you're completely undocumented, that you want to just say the least you can say at that point. I want to go back to then the previous slide that Parima said, is just don't say anything at all. Like you're in that situation, they're arresting you. I need to speak to my lawyer. I'm not going to speak. I want to like invoke my right to remain silent. Like Parima mentioned, it's the US government's burden to prove that you're not a US citizen, that you are a foreign national, that you are deportable. So we don't want to give them any of that information. We want to make them prove their burden. And then to one more thing I just want to say again that Parima said a few times is so important here is these are scary rights to invoke, and we're seeing that play out the last few weeks. So these are like ideal ways that you're going to react in these situations, and we're human. I, as an attorney, find myself stumbling in some of these like high stress situations. Just because you didn't do it at the top doesn't mean if it kicks in the middle, you can't be like, actually, I want to stop talking, or actually now you're in my house, but did you have a judicial warrant? If not, I'd like you to leave. So you can kind of invoke it halfway through. Whatever you do to invoke it, just to reiterate, it may not help you in that moment, but it will help your legal team later as we try to fight this case from all angles, which is one, the US government hasn't even met their burden to prove this person is deportable, or during the course of the arrest, during the course of the apprehension, during the course of the detention, they violated multiple of their own guidelines by not identifying themselves, by wearing masks, by taking them out of the jurisdiction. So those are all angles attorneys will come out later to try to protect someone in that situation. So that's kind of like context. So going on to the campus situation, it's very similar in terms, like the basic things apply. In a non-public space, ICE should not be allowed in. ICE is not allowed in, doesn't have to be allowed in unless they have a judicial warrant. So we just added this specific scenario, of course, because it's top of mind for many of us who work or attend college campuses, areas of higher education as faculty, staff, and students, scholars. So basically here to federal immigration enforcement officers can enter public spaces, just like anyone else can enter a public sidewalk that's leading up to the university. If you have an open campus, they can walk onto the quad like others can. But this is why now when you're thinking about your vulnerability on campus, you're thinking about your student communities, administrators should be thinking about how to protect our campus and demarcate public from non-public spaces. And so non-public spaces would be the point where, as in the home, Parima pointed out, that's where the door is closed. And you're saying, as a university official, ICE can only enter this area with that judicial warrant and only that judicial warrant. So for administrators and people who are thinking about these things, you want to think about your campus and what is the point where only someone with a university issued ID can enter. That is one way to think about what is now a private space. Are there locked doors? Are there monitored entryways? University residence halls? Many campuses are putting up signs to kind of be like, this is only allowed in with university ID, not public space. Something that kind of shores up the argument that now entering here is a private space that requires a judicial warrant. So that's the warrant piece. We're getting a lot of questions, all of us, like attorneys who are presenting to you today from universities. So it's good. These are good times to ask your university what their protocol is. So if ICE comes to my campus, what are you going to do? How is my university safety officer going to handle that situation? Do we have general counsel who's going to come meet ICE at the door and check for that warrant? How will they, if ICE does have a warrant, God forbid, to enter a university setting, will they be accompanied by a university administrator to go directly to that one place they're supposed to go, or will they be allowed to roam freely within the university? Those are the kinds of questions that we should all be asking of our university administrators. And one thing on the CVIS part that Muslim advocates so helpfully share, just like a few pointers as we're learning, because we're getting a lot of questions from foreign students, is also they're saying check your email daily and make sure your university is also checking those platforms multiple times a day, so they are becoming aware where someone's foreign scholar, foreign student status is being revoked. So just another piece to think about. Ask your university about their protocols in these changing times. Okay, so after ICE contact, and we're just going to get this started and then turn it over to our colleague from NIAC, Ludrea, who's here. But what to do after an arrest? Thank you. So again, like Parima started talking about, remain silent. You're not going to want to sign anything. You're not going to want to give anything away. You're going to try to get on the phone to your attorney and to your family member to let them know where you are. And going back to what I was saying, you don't want to give away that you're not a U.S. citizen or you're a foreign national. You don't have to give them that information. So don't tell ICE where you're from, even if they ask you. Don't sign anything without getting to speak to that attorney first. And I know I keep saying speak to an attorney, and everyone's like, where am I going to find an attorney? That's an excellent question. There are organizations, and we're sharing resources where like there are numbers you can call in an emergency situation. Maybe it wouldn't be like full representation, but at least to get you through these emergency moments. So we will be sharing those resources with you. You don't want to hand over documents. Again, anything that gives away that you're a foreign national. You don't have to hand over anything. You can simply say, I mean, it's easy for me to simply say that if you're not carrying it on you, say, I don't have these documents on me. And that's a question we also get a lot is, should I be carrying documents that kind of prove that I'm from a foreign country on me, like a passport? And we're saying, no, carry an ID that doesn't really give away your nationality. Maybe it's like a New York City ID, something like that, which it's not obvious that what your citizenship or immigration status is not apparent from that ID. Because ID, especially that foreign passport, can speed up deportation, so that's the reason we're saying that here. And yes, going back to never lie to ICE, never give false documents, don't make like a false assertion about any kind of status. That's never a good idea. And one thing we, at the end of our part is, what if ICE arrests your loved one? We want to point out that there is an ICE locator, a detainee locator. You can Google that. It'll come up. You put somebody's A number, their name, their country of origin, and that is one way to try to find out where someone might be. There are like huge obstacles. It's not updated. In a lot of our recent cases, people have just been lost, and you've been hearing in the news for like 24 to 48 hours. We don't know where they're detained, and then we find out they're in Louisiana. So there's that piece. I do think in this moment, it's good to have like a check-in system with loved ones who are vulnerable in the ways that Muslim advocates described. There's a lot of people who are kind of on edge and feel like they might. And it's good to be like, okay, if I don't hear from you in 3 hours, we will check in with each other and kind of create a norm. Think about community safety. Think about checking on each other and your neighbors. And yeah, well, I'll turn it over to Dre. Thanks.
I don't have a PowerPoint, but I mean, I feel like a lot has been covered. I think the one thing I will add. Oh, thanks. Wow, this is very official up here. I'm Drea, by the way. Hi, I'm with the New York Civil Liberties Union, or the New York affiliate of the American Civil Liberties Union. I'm sure most folks in here have heard of us, but we fight for civil rights, and the New York affiliate fights for civil rights specifically here in New York State. So thinking through what we can do on both a local level and a state level to protect immigrants, and not just protect their rights, but also advance civil rights as well. So one thing I did want to add was just that there's one key phrase if you are arrested that we all should remember. I want to speak to a lawyer. That's been mentioned multiple times, but saying, I want to speak to a lawyer is going to be key here, right? Like just remembering that phrase. We have some Know Your Rights cards actually at the front that are in English, Spanish, or not Spanish, Arabic, Farsi. I have Spanish in my bag, but we also have a lot of other languages. If people ever need them, you can feel free to, reach out or just go on our website as well. And they actually have, on one side, it has it in like Farsi or Arabic, and then on the other side, it's actually in English. So you can just slide it under the door if somebody does come to your home. And a lot of the phrases that were mentioned are also written on the card in English. So if you know anyone who doesn't speak English, those cards are a great option for them so that they can, slide it under the door, show it to someone, their wallet size so they can fit in anybody's wallet or pocket. So I just feel free to grab some on your way out. If you are arrested, obviously all the rights that have been mentioned apply, right? Like your right to remain silent. It was already mentioned, do not sign anything without a lawyer. But the key thing is when you are arrested by ICE, you have the right to speak to a lawyer, but they don't have to provide you with one if you can't afford one. In the same way that if you were going through criminal court proceedings, they would need to provide you with one, which is really messed up. There's some funding in New York State through what's called Knife Up, which is a group of different legal service providers that have some funding from the state to support people. And so we can share some hotlines. Maybe we can email folks those hotline numbers in the case that you or a loved one is detained. But it's just really important to note that you will have to hire a lawyer, which at the ACLU we feel is a due process issue. We're actually trying to pass something here in New York State called the Access to Representation Act, which would, I think it would be $165 million to go towards making sure that people actually have representation. We don't think people should have the burden of having to pay out of their pocket. And this is a due process issue. If people don't have access to good representation, it impacts everything in their proceedings. It impacts how long they're in detention. It impacts, whether or not they actually do stay here, are able to stay here, or are separated from their families. So we really do need to pass the Access to Representation Act in New York. I was also going to mention, and this isn't really about being arrested, but a lot of these phrases can also be used with police as well. You won't always know if you're interacting with an immigration officer. Sometimes it will say ICE, sometimes it will say police. And so I just kind of wanted to add that. But these phrases and these rights apply in situations with any law enforcement officer. But that's just the one difference if you are arrested. Emergency planning was also mentioned, so I won't go through that again. But Make the Road has a really great emergency planning document. I can also share that with folks after we finish here as well. And then I can just go straight into. I don't know how much time do we have. Okay, 5 minutes. All right, great. So that's a little bit about when you're arrested. And I think the key thing, just to wrap up the arrest piece before we move on to proactive things that our state can do, one of the biggest things we're talking about, hopefully we don't get to that point. We don't want to get to the point where you are arrested. And so we want to make sure you have an emergency plan, but there's also proactive things that you can do as well. So if you do choose to protest, but you are someone who feels that you are at risk of being arrested for a lot of the, risks that were shared before, make sure someone in your life knows where you are. Right? That's the big thing. When we're talking about the ICE locator, it doesn't update that much. If someone in your life knows where you are and where you're going, that will help people find where you are, right? And so I just wanted to note that there's a lot of things you can do before protesting, and there's also a little like know your rights to protest as well in the back there. So going into New York State, there are things that we can actually do here in New York State to stop being complicit with this mass deportation machine. Get ICE the F out of here, am I right? Yeah, we do not have to roll out the red carpet for ICE here in New York State. There's a lot of other states that have passed bills to say we will not conspire with ICE. And so there's two bills that I'm going to talk about. The first one is dignity not detention, which would get New York State out of the business of immigration detention. A lot of people don't know this, but right here in New York State, we actually have several jails that have beds specifically for ICE, specifically for immigrants, to hold them for ICE. So we don't need to be doing that. Our jails don't need to be places where we're holding people for ICE. And dignity not detention is about ending those contracts between local jails and ICE and making it illegal for any local or state entity, so think hospitals, schools, to become places where they will try and use those facilities for detention, which, you know, this is about stopping detention expansion in our state, which we know the less number of beds that are available, the less present ICE is. There are reports that show that. And so dignity, not detention. The second thing is New York for all, which Eton is, yeah. New York for all is about getting New York State out of the business of immigration enforcement. So New York for all would prohibit any state or local agency, including police, from conspiring with ICE. So that's sharing information about status, that's disclosing any sensitive information. It would also cut off access to some of the databases that we talk, like some of the records and like criminal databases, for example, right? Which is huge because we know that ICE relies on these databases. ICE relies on state and local agencies to share information with them so that they can find people. So if we pass New York for all, that would cut off some of the biggest ways that ICE uses to target people in our state and separate families. So we have some postcards up there addressed to the governor. We have a lot of co-sponsors on New York for all, but our legislators, our state legislators are really dragging their feet on these bills that could really help protect New Yorkers. And so we need you to actually really speak up. Call your representatives, tell them to do everything they can to pass dignity not detention and New York for all, because they need to hear from you. Those postcards are addressed to the governor, and she needs to hear from us too, right? We need to say, you know, just keep ICE out, right? When immigrants are under attack, what do we do? What do we do? What do we do? That's right. Thank you. Sorry, that was wrong.
Oh, thank you, Drea. Thank you so much. Let's hear it for our panelists. Thank you so much. To close us out, I would like to welcome Miriam Schreib from CARE New York to join me in a community discussion here. I think you got to flip it on. Oh, there you go.
Hey guys.
Hey.
Oh,
Please
okay.
introduce yourself.
Hi everyone. My name is Mariam. I'm the community program organizer from the Council on American Islamic Relations, and in short, CARE New York. So essentially, we are a nonprofit C3 organization that is dedicated to protecting the civil liberties of all Muslim Americans across New York State. We are one of over 20 chapters across the nation, and our central mission is just to ensure that every single Muslim American, regardless of any status whatsoever, is protected and knows of their civil liberties to the best that they can. And so we are in part a rapid response organization, and Dre basically hit on every single point that I had on my agenda. So shout out to you. But what I was going to say is I'm going to emphasize Dre's point, which is that contacting your state legislatures is very, very, very important. At the very least, know who they are, recognize their faces and understand the policies that they themselves support. Because on the off chance that your city council member is someone that you don't necessarily coincide with, your voice is very valuable at any given time, and they really want to hear your voice. Be it you probably have to call their office multiple times before they actually answer, but that does not mean that you should not call. And in addition to what Care New York does in order to kind of respond to these questionable times that we're at right now, very unpredictable, is that we're always out in the community giving Know Your Rights workshops like the one that you guys have just witnessed today. So shout out to CUNY Law students. You guys are amazing. And in the past 2 months alone, we have gotten over 20 requests from community organizations to give these Know Your Rights workshops. So this is just an indicator that this is something that is very, very high in demand. Everybody wants to know their rights, and everyone who isn't necessarily a non-citizen or anyone who isn't necessarily, someone who is an international student on a visa really wants to know like what they can do in these situations, because at the end of the day, you really want to make sure that you have all of your bases covered, especially right now as we're witnessing a continuation of the genocide that has been ongoing over the past year, that people really also want to get very politically motivated and want to go out into protests, but they also want to make sure that their safety is prioritized. And so at Care New York, we have different KYR workshops. We offer immigration workshops, but we also offer law enforcement workshops, what to do when you're approached by the NYPD, when you're approached by the SRG, which is essential. No, I'm not a lawyer. This is not legal advice, but stay silent if you are approached by the NYPD. I'm not a lawyer yet. But this is Care New York and other organizations, especially these that are featured today, like Muslim Advocates, Night Clue, CUNY Law, are really here to respond to the most unpredictable circumstances that our community is facing. Because at the end of the day, who keeps us safe, y'all? We keep us safe. So it is very, very important to recognize who your community members are, who your community advocates are in the room, and also beyond this room, because at the end of the day, it is really your community members who have your best interests in mind. And I also just want to give a very special shout out real quick to one of the law firms that Care New York has been working very, very closely with in the past. We have Carlos in the room. You can raise your hand, Carlos. Carlos has been working with, and I'm very sorry to mispronounce, but a very, very notable law firm who has recently won a class action lawsuit, which if you have been, or if you know someone who has been unlawfully detained by ICE between 1997 and 2012, they do have the ability to get compensation for that. And Carlos is in the room here, so if you have any questions about that, you can go to Carlos and can answer anything that you may or may not have. And this is just an example of some of the things that your community organizations can do for you, because at the very end of the day, we have your best interest in mind. Care New York and other organizations here as well are always here for you whenever you need us. We are also not just here during unpredictable times like the ones that we are witnessing today. We are always here, whether or not immigrants are at risk, whether or not our First Amendment right to free speech is also at risk. We are always a form of response for you whenever you need us. And I'll pass it off to Ethan.
Thank you so much, Mariam. And so I want to close with just by sharing some thoughts beyond Know Your Rights, because these spaces are crucial, but they're frankly not enough. We are not seeing nearly enough from our lawmakers, from our leaders at all. I mean, I think it's unacceptable that Democratic leaders in New York haven't gone to Louisiana, to this detention facility. Why are they not there? Why are volunteers from CARE, from NIAC, we had NIAC volunteers in Chicago track down Ali Reza Daroudi and where he was being held before any member of the press or any Democratic lawmaker, and that's unacceptable. That's a problem. CARE and legal groups have capacity to do that rapid response. Small nonprofits do not. And we are going to keep filling that gap as best we can. I have too many Iranian American women lawyers around the country blowing up my phone saying, where are we going to find this guy? Why are we not talking to this attorney general? Why are we not working with this group? And so just hosting this event, you showing up here tonight, is a shining example of how we can organize and show New York to be the standard for how we accept all people into the United States and how we do not criminalize basic civil rights. And this is something that Iranian Americans have understood for years. Iranian Americans have disproportionately had their bank accounts closed. Last year, there was a lawsuit brought against Bank of America, which revealed that just Bank of America had shut down over 15,000 accounts of Iranian Americans. And when you have your bank account closed, you can't do anything. We have been pushing on the travel ban from last year. We got a commitment from Biden while he was campaigning that he would revoke the travel ban. We did not endorse Biden last election, by the way. Again, instead we surveyed, we would never, whoops. We surveyed the community. And I do want to close with some more thoughts of how we can show up and push these institutions. So again, all the groups here and a number of other groups. Again, a shout out to New York State Attorney General Tish James, because she is showing up. She is throwing down for the community. They beat the birthright citizenship executive order, which was ridiculous and un-American, and we want to help them beat the travel ban. And we want to help them beat the anti-Semitism executive order, which, as a Jew, has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. We are well positioned to do this, and it would make perfect sense right now for all of us to acknowledge that Schumer and Jeffries and AOC should be grabbing these issues by the horns, but they're not. And they're not going to unless we continue to push them. And it's organizations like NIAC's philosophy that you have to both create political rewards and political costs. So, the costs, I think they're clear to all of us. And we need to continue to put pressure points on them for every single case, for every single person like Alireza Daroudi or Rumeysa Ozturk or Mahmoud Khalil. Every single one of those cases needs to continue to get pressed and put in front of their eyes by all of you. But at the top level, at the grass tops level, organizers like us are very eager to get together and to work with you all to help amplify these issues and this information to our lawmakers. And we need to keep pressing them. It can't just come from one group. It has to come at multiple points. In DC with their DC office and here in New York with their state director. They should be hearing it from their local council member. And that all takes work. And frankly, the other side of these issues, Beitar, Canary Mission, AIPAC, they show up in those spaces. ALEC, a longtime project of the Heritage Foundation, shows up in state legislatures. So projects like the New York for All Act are vital. They offer a shred, not just a shred, but a real beacon of hope for people around the country, for Iranian Americans in California, in Chicago, in Seattle, who are all looking at this event right now, who I'm going to be like, that you are all part of a much larger national conversation, and it can get as local as your city council member. So I think it's important to hold those truths and to feel empowered to participate with our NIAC chapter, with any of the leaders here, to start something of your own, in your own locality, related to these, to host your own Know Your Rights event, to contact your neighbor, to ask your friend who's donated to Democrats in the past or donated to Republicans in the past to say, hey, instead of donating to these people who are tearing our country apart, help fix it. So that's sort of my impassioned pitch to you. And I will close with one last thing. I spoke at the historic Riverside Church in Uptown a few weeks ago. Their pastor was so moved by the stories of Mahmoud Khalil and Rumeysa Ozturk, and she wants to throw down and get in front of Schumer's office to demand that he get to Louisiana. And let this not be the last Know Your Rights event, but let's think far beyond just knowing our rights and how we can fight to get them back. So thank you so much for being here. I think we can cut the recording, Hiba, and we can just hang out and talk